The air inside the field hospital was thick with the metallic scent of blood and antiseptic. Generators hummed in the background, keeping the fluorescent lights alive, while boots scraped against the concrete floor as medics rushed from cot to cot. The place wasn't new to chaos-broken bones, dehydration, and exhaustion were constant companions here, but that afternoon felt different. They wheeled her in quietly, almost too quietly, as if her presence carried its own gravity. A stretcher rolled across the floor, its thin wheels squeaking with each turn, and on it lay a woman, young, wounded, but oddly composed. The medics who had seen countless trainees crumble under far less couldn't help but glance at her, again. Something about her demanded attention. Her body told a story of strain and endurance. Her uniform was torn at the knees, streaked with mud and dried blood. Her arms bore long scratches, souvenirs of a brutal training ground where nature tested the limits of anyone foolish or brave enough to push against it. Yet her face was steady. No tears, no cries for help. Only the quiet, unyielding gaze of someone who had learned long ago that pain was not an enemy, but a companion. The SEAL medics surrounded her, working with mechanical precision. They checked her vitals, pressed gauze against her wounds, and prepared 4 lines. One of them, a seasoned medic named Torres, paused longer than the rest. He had seen grown men scream at the first touch of disinfectant, but she didn't flinch. Not even once. "Pressure's stable," another medic muttered. Torres nodded, but kept his eyes on her. Something wasn't adding up. Around them, other trainees moaned, groaned, or argued weakly with their caretakers. The field hospital was rarely quiet. It was filled with the raw sounds of people hitting their limits. But near her cot, silence lingered. She didn't complain, didn't demand, didn't ask how bad her injury was. Her calm unnerved them. It was the kind of calm that usually came from experience, not inexperience. "Name?" Torres asked gently, bending close so she could hear him. Her lips parted, and she gave it quiet, firm, but without explanation. No introduction, no excuses. Just her name, as if that alone was enough to account for her being there. The medics carried on, yet their curiosity only deepened. Most trainees came in with stories spilling from their mouths. Some exaggerated their hardships, desperate for recognition. Others confessed fears, clinging to medics like lifelines. She offered nothing. "Pain level?" another asked, tapping at a clipboard. "Manageable," she said simply. No dramatics, no bravado. Just truth stripped bare. Her restraint made them exchange quick glances. Manageable wasn't how most described a deep leg injury and bruised ribs. Most would have rated it a 9 or 10 on the scale. She answered as though pain were just another part of life, like hunger or fatigue, something to be noted, but never complained about. Outside the tent, the wind carried dust across the training compound. The sound of distant shouts, whistles, and boots pounding against dirt echoed faintly. The survival course was still underway, chewing up bodies and spitting out broken spirits. Inside, however, time seemed to slow around her cot. Torres leaned back slightly, studying her face. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, but her eyes carried something older. They weren't the eyes of someone pampered or naive. They were eyes that had seen storms and survived them. He thought back to the hundreds of trainees he had patched up over the years. They all fit a type. The privileged athlete whose body betrayed him, the tough talker who broke down when reality hit, the quiet one who underestimated how cruel training could be. But she didn't fit any of those molds. She wasn't boasting, and she wasn't collapsing into despair. She was simply enduring, as if endurance itself had been woven into her skin. A younger medic, Miller, finally spoke what they were all thinking. "Where did she come from?" he muttered, not realizing she could hear him. Her eyes flickered briefly toward him, but she said nothing. Miller shifted uncomfortably, suddenly embarrassed. It wasn't that her silence was cold, it was piercing. Like she could see through the question, through the curiosity, straight into the assumptions they carried about her. The silence unsettled the team. They were trained to read patients quickly, to spot weakness, fear, or bravado. With her, they found none. Only quiet strength. Torres bent closer again, his curiosity sharpening. "You've been through worse before, haven't you?" he asked quietly. For the first time, the faintest trace of a smile curved her lips. Not wide, not playful, just enough to confirm his suspicion. She didn't need to answer. The truth was written across her face, in the calmness of her breathing, in the way her hands rested by her sides instead of trembling like most under stress. The other trainees in nearby cots watched her too. Some frowned, annoyed that their groans and complaints suddenly seemed louder, more desperate, compared to her silence. Others stared in awe, perhaps inspired by her ability to sit there, broken but unbroken. Within minutes, she became the unspoken center of the room. One trainee whispered, "Who is she?" Another muttered, "She's tougher than half the guys out there," but she didn't respond to any of it. She wasn't here for attention. She wasn't here to prove herself through words. Whatever had driven her this far existed long before she stepped into this training ground. Torres cleaned the gash on her leg, watching carefully for a reaction. Most would wince, hiss, or pull away. She didn't move. The only sign of discomfort was a slight narrowing of her eyes, but even that vanished quickly, controlled like a secret. "You know," Torres said, voice low so only she could hear, "most people flinch. Doesn't mean they're weak, just human." She looked at him, unblinking. "I flinched long before today." It was the only explanation she gave, and it left Torres thoughtful. What had she endured before this course? What battles had hardened her so completely that even here, surrounded by strangers, bleeding and exhausted, she refused to show fragility? The medics worked in silence after that, their curiosity growing, but their respect deepening. They didn't need her full story to know one thing: she was different. By the time her wounds were cleaned and bandaged, a quiet reverence hung in the air. Even Miller, who had doubted her at first, handled the equipment with more care around her. Something about her silence commanded respect in a way that no rank or medal could. Torres made a final note on her chart, but his eyes lingered on her once more. He didn't press her with more questions. He knew instinctively that whatever story lay behind her eyes was not one to be dragged out carelessly. And so, the field hospital returned to its rhythm. Shouts from other patients, clattering equipment, the sharp smell of antiseptic. But around her cot, silence remained her shield, her language, her power. She had arrived wounded, but wordless, and in that wordlessness, she had already left them speechless. Long before the stretcher, before the hushed whispers in the field hospital, her life had already been a series of trials. She came from a place the world rarely noticed, a small town tucked between endless stretches of farmland and forgotten roads. It was the kind of town where people measured success by surviving, not thriving. Opportunities were few, dreams were fragile, and those who dared to hope too loudly often found their voices drowned out by poverty and resignation. From the very beginning, silence was her inheritance. Her family didn't have much, not money, not influence, not even stability. Her father worked long hours at a factory that stole more of his body with every shift. Her mother stitched clothes in a dimly lit room, her fingers raw from needles and thread. Arguments about bills were frequent, but even those arguments had an undercurrent of quiet despair. Words weren't used to solve problems in her house. They were used to survive the day. She learned quickly that if she wanted something different, she would have to carve it out for herself. And so she did in silence. At dawn, when the air was still crisp and the town lay under a blanket of fog, she laced up worn-out sneakers that had already seen better days. They were too small for her feet, the sawless thin, but she ran anyway. She ran down dirt paths lined with cornfields, past houses that leaned with age, past neighbors who shook their heads at her determination. The gravel bit into her shoes, and sometimes into her skin, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was moving forward, one step at a time, away from the life that tried to cage her. At school, she was quiet, not because she lacked thoughts, but because she knew few cared to hear them. Teachers often overlooked her, assuming silence meant ignorance. But in that silence, she absorbed everything. She studied harder than her classmates, not because anyone expected her to, but because she understood knowledge was one of the few things that couldn't be taken away. When others spent afternoons hanging around gas stations or scrolling on their phones, she trained. She turned chores into exercises, lifting buckets of water as though they were weights, chopping wood until her shoulders burned, sprinting to the far end of fields just to beat her own time. Her environment didn't offer gyms or personal trainers, but she didn't need them. Every tool, every obstacle became part of her training ground. Her neighbors noticed, though they didn't always understand. "That girl's strange," they whispered. Always pushing herself for no reason. Some dismissed her as restless, others as stubborn. None realized she was quietly building the foundation for the battles ahead. It wasn't just her body she trained. Nights were often the hardest, when the world grew still and her thoughts grew loud. She would sit in the dim light of a second-hand lamp, flipping through borrowed books. Some were about survival techniques, how to navigate with stars, how to start fires with nothing but friction, how to endure when resources ran thin. Others were about psychology and resilience, teaching her how the human mind could bend or break under pressure. Each page was a revelation, a mentor bound in ink and paper. She didn't talk about her ambitions. To voice them aloud in her town was to invite ridicule. People there had long since stopped believing in possibilities. So she carried her dreams in silence, tucking them away like secrets too precious to share. But dreams alone weren't enough. She needed discipline. One winter, the cold bit so hard that pipes froze, and her family had to live without running water for days. Most bundled up and waited for the weather to pass. She, however, saw an opportunity. Every morning before school, she chopped wood until her hands blistered. Then she practiced running in the snow, her legs burning with every step. The cold was merciless, but she welcomed it, teaching herself how to endure discomfort without complaint. "If I can beat this," she whispered to herself, breath clouding in the frigid air, "I can beat anything." The truth was, she didn't have role models. No decorated athletes, no veterans, no mentors stood to guide her. Instead, she looked inward, shaping herself with an intensity that both frightened and fascinated those around her. Her friends few as they were often asked why she trained so hard. She never gave a full answer. Sometimes she just shrugged. Other times she'd say, "Because I need to." That was all. Behind her silence lay the memory of countless small battles. The time she fought through hunger because food at home was scarce. The day she carried her mother's groceries for miles because they couldn't afford a car repair. The nights she stayed awake to finish homework by candlelight when the power was cut off again. Each challenge etched resilience into her bones. Each hardship was another layer of armor. By her late teens, she was different from her peers. While others partied or planned ordinary futures, she lived in her own world of discipline. Her hands were calloused, her legs strong, her back straight from years of labor and training. She had grown into someone who didn't need validation, applause, or attention. Her victories were private, her defeats her own to bear. And perhaps that was the most defining trait of all her relationship with silence. She didn't speak about her suffering, didn't share her ambitions, didn't explain her routines. Words had never done much for her family, and she learned early that they couldn't carry her forward. Action could. Discipline could. Grit could. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was power. Neighbors might not have known the details, but they noticed the results. The girl who once blended into the background now carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. Even in stillness, she seemed unshakable, like a tree rooted deep in the earth. It was this foundation, built through years of invisible struggle, that would one day carry her through the survival course. When others gasped at icy waters, she remembered winter runs through snowdrifts. When others collapsed from exhaustion, she recalled carrying burdens heavier than her own strength. When others panicked in the dark, she remembered long nights alone with nothing but silence. Her past wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't celebrated, but it had written her into someone rare, someone who could be broken physically, yet remain unbroken in spirit. And so, by the time she stepped into the world of grueling military training, she carried with her not just a body sharpened by hardship, but a silence so profound that it left even seasoned warriors speechless. Her story wasn't about where she came from. It was about what she had built in silence, long before anyone was watching. Her world had never offered her easy paths, and when it came to her dream of pushing herself beyond the ordinary, the barriers stood taller than most could imagine. There were no elite coaches in her town, no training academies, no programs designed to take someone like her and polish her into a warrior. What she had was a stubborn will, a restless spirit, and a silence that carried her further than the loudest encouragement ever could. At first, her methods looked almost laughable. She scavenged scraps from construction sites to fashion makeshift weights. 2 rusted paint buckets filled with gravel became her first barbell. An old rope tied to a tree became her climbing course. A fallen log in the woods became her balance beam, slick with morning dew and treacherous enough to throw her off countless times. She bore the bruises quietly, limping home without complaint, her family none the wiser. When her peers looked at her, they saw only a quiet young woman who blended into the background. None of them suspected that, long after the town lights dimmed, she was out there in the darkness, running laps until her lungs burned, or crawling through the mud to mimic obstacle courses she had only seen in grainy videos. Books became her first teachers. She scoured survival manuals, strength guides, and biographies of warriors. She read about endurance training, about nutrition, about mental fortitude. She underlined passages, memorized strategies, and then put them to the test, often failing miserably. Her first attempt at a fire-starting technique ended with nothing but smoke and blistered fingers. Her early pull-ups ended with her flat on her back. Her attempts at long-distance running ended in breathless collapses by the roadside. But failure never discouraged her. It simply pointed her toward another lesson. Her body became a canvas of these lessons. Scars bloomed on her shins from tripping over obstacles in the dark. Calluses hardened her palms until they felt like sandpaper. Her knees bore faint reminders of falls she never admitted to anyone. Each mark was proof of a battle fought alone, victories carved not in applause but in perseverance. Still, the world around her didn't understand. Her friends drifted toward the lives expected of them, jobs, parties, casual relationships. They couldn't fathom why she obsessed over training with no coach and no audience. "Why?" one asked once, half joking, half serious. "You think you're going to be some kind of soldier?" She had only shrugged. To explain herself would be to invite disbelief or ridicule. It was easier to let silence answer for her. Yet deep inside, she was building something none of them could see. Her nights of running in the dark honed her endurance. Her experiments with bodyweight drills gave her strength. Her hours of mental conditioning, sitting still and focusing through discomfort, sharpened her mind. Slowly, she was sculpting herself into someone the world hadn't anticipated. There were nights she doubted herself. Nights when exhaustion pressed against her bones so hard she wanted to collapse and never get up. Nights when she asked the quiet air around her if it was worth it. But then she would remember the small town that had tried to shrink her dreams, the narrow lives everyone had accepted, and the weight of her silence would transform into fuel. She wasn't just training her body, she was breaking chains, proving to herself that she didn't need permission to be more. One memory stood out. She had found an old video of a military obstacle course challenge online. Fascinated, she tried to recreate it in the woods nearby. Logs stood in for barriers, muddy ditches for crawl spaces. It was crude, clumsy, and dangerous. She fell more than she succeeded, scraped her arms raw on branches, and once hit the ground so hard she thought she had broken something. She lay there, staring at the sky, breath knocked out of her. The stars blinked coldly above, indifferent to her struggle. For a moment, she wanted to quit. But then, she laughed softly to herself, painful, breathless laughter. No one was watching. No one cared if she got up. No one would judge her if she walked away. And maybe that was the very reason she had to rise. Slowly aching, she pushed herself to her feet and tried again. That night, her silence spoke louder than any vow she could have made. Her training wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She learned how to keep calm when her body screamed in pain, how to stay focused when everything went wrong. She practiced meditation techniques she found buried in psychology books, teaching herself to breathe through discomfort until her mind grew still. She deliberately trained in the rain, in the cold, in the dark, forcing herself to adapt to discomfort. She welcomed every hardship as a rehearsal for the future. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how little recognition she sought. She didn't film herself, didn't brag online, didn't even confide in those closest to her. To the world, she remained quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. Only she knew the truth of her journey. Over time, her silence became her shield. When others mocked her for being different, she didn't waste breath defending herself. When they underestimated her, she let them. Their ignorance was her secret advantage. Every scar, every bruise, every quiet victory added to a foundation that no ridicule could shake. One evening, as she hung from a rope she had tied to a tree branch, her arms trembling with fatigue, she realized something profound. She wasn't waiting for the world to give her permission anymore. She wasn't training to prove anyone wrong. She was training because this was who she was becoming, someone who thrived in the quiet, who built herself in the shadows, who didn't need recognition to know her worth. The scars on her body, the grit in her spirit, the calluses on her hands, these were not marks of failure. They were the signatures of her secret victories. And though no one knew it yet, though the world would not see it until much later, she had already broken the greatest barrier of all, the belief that greatness required recognition. She had built herself alone, and in silence, she was becoming unstoppable. The day the course began, the air itself felt heavy. The compound buzzed with anticipation, the kind that makes stomachs churn before a storm. Rows of trainees stood shoulder to shoulder, some trying to mask their nerves with forced bravado, others already pale from the weight of expectation. Among them, she stood quietly, her expression unreadable. No one there knew her past, her years of secret training, her battles fought in solitude. To them, she was just another name on the roster, another hopeful stepping into a program designed to break almost everyone. And perhaps that anonymity was her greatest weapon. The instructors wasted no time. They barked orders like thunderclaps, their voices slicing through the morning air. Packs were thrown onto backs, heavier than most could manage. The first march began with no warning, boots striking the dirt in chaotic rhythm. Trainees grunted under the weight, some stumbling within minutes. She adjusted the straps of her pack and moved forward, her body instinctively adapting. The weight crushed her shoulders, dug into her hips, but it was nothing she hadn't felt before. Years of hauling water buckets and carrying logs through snowstorms had prepared her for this. Where others cursed and complained, she pressed her lips together and kept moving. The miles stretched endlessly. Heat baked the ground, dust filled their lungs, and sweat drenched uniforms until they clung like second skins. Around her, men began to slow. Some cursed loudly, others begged for rest. A few tried to motivate themselves with shouts. She did none of that. Her silence was steady, her pace relentless. When night fell, the real test began. The trainees were ordered into icy waters, the kind that bites straight to the bones. Shivering bodies splashed desperately, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Instructors watched with cold eyes, timing every movement. Failure was punished with more. She waded in without hesitation. The cold wrapped around her like chains, stabbing at her ribs, numbing her fingers. She focused on her breathing steady, controlled, the way she had practiced during winters back home. Every exhale formed a faint mist above the surface. While others screamed, cursed, or begged to be pulled out, she endured in silence, her body trembling, but her mind refusing to surrender. Hours blurred together. Sleep deprivation gnawed at the trainees, their eyes bloodshot, their movements sluggish. She knew this kind of exhaustion. She remembered late nights training by the dim light of her lamp, the countless times she forced herself to push through fatigue when the world around her slept. That memory carried her now. But the course wasn't only about endurance. It was about breaking people mentally, physically, spiritually. Instructors created chaos, shouting conflicting orders, forcing trainees to crawl through mud, climb impossible walls, and carry each other across brutal distances. The stronger were paired with the weaker, the confident dragged down by the panicked. It was designed so that no one could win alone. She adapted quietly. She lifted when others couldn't, carried when others fell, and supported without complaint. Yet she never demanded recognition. Her silence remained her armor, her greatest weapon. Those around her began to notice. While others wasted energy on grumbling or shouting, she conserved hers for the fight itself. Her actions spoke more than her words ever could. But silence couldn't protect her forever. On the fifth day, exhaustion caught her. The march was longer than any before, packs heavier, the terrain rougher. Rocks bit into her boots until blisters burst. Her legs screamed, her ribs ached from the earlier cold water drills, and her vision blurred with fatigue. For the first time, her body betrayed her spirit. She stumbled, knees hitting the dirt. The instructors didn't pause. They never did. Their eyes watched like hawks, waiting to see who would break completely. Around her, some collapsed and never rose again. Medics hauled them away. Their dreams ended with a single stumble. For a brief moment, lying on the ground, she wondered if this was the end for her too. The weight of her pack pressed into her back. The taste of dirt filled her mouth, and her heart hammered like a war drum. Quitting would be easy. No one would blame her. No one expected her to survive this far anyway. But then, something stirred inside her. A memory, faint but fierce. The nights she ran alone in the dark. The laughter of those who doubted her. The endless battles she had already survived. She remembered the promise she had made silently to herself. Never surrender. With a groan, she pushed her palms into the dirt and forced herself upright. Her legs shook violently. Her lungs begged for air, but she took one step forward. Then another. And another. Every stride was agony, but she moved like a machine, fueled not by strength, but by refusal. By the time the march ended, she was bleeding from her blisters, her knees scraped raw, her shoulders raw from the straps of her pack. Yet she was still standing, barely but standing. That night, as the instructors barked new orders and exhausted trainees collapsed wherever they could, she sat quietly, bandaging her feet with torn scraps of cloth. Around her, whispers traveled. "Did you see her? Thought she was done? Then she just got up again. She's tougher than she looks. She hasn't said a word all week." She ignored them. Words had never mattered. Survival did. The final test came sooner than expected. A forced march through the night, straight into a brutal obstacle course, designed to destroy whatever fragments of strength remained. Walls to climb, ropes to ascend, mud to crawl through, rivers to cross. Each section claimed more trainees, their bodies finally giving out. She stumbled through it, half delirious, driven by instinct alone. Every muscle screamed, every joint begged her to stop. She slipped on a rope, her hands torn open, blood slicking the fibers. But she clenched tighter and hauled herself up. She crawled through mud until it filled her mouth and nose. She slammed her shoulder against a wall until, finally, her fingers found the grip and she pulled herself over. And then, at last, her body broke. A sharp pain shot through her leg as she landed wrong. Her knee buckled, sending her crashing to the ground. She tried to rise, but the pain was unbearable. Medics rushed in, their faces unreadable, and lifted her away. For the first time, she couldn't move forward. The silence that had carried her so far now hung heavy in the air. The course had claimed her body, but it had not claimed her spirit. Even in defeat, she had proven something none could deny. She was built from a different fire. The field hospital was alive with noise. Cots lined the tent in uneven rows, every one of them filled with trainees who had surrendered to exhaustion or been betrayed by their bodies. Medics hurried from patient to patient, bandaging wounds, checking vitals, injecting fluids. Voices overlapped groans, curses, whispered prayers. It was chaos, organized only by the steady rhythm of trained hands. And yet, around her cot, there was a strange stillness. She lay with her leg braced, her ribs tightly wrapped, an IV feeding life back into her dehydrated veins. The injury had taken her from the course, but not even pain had stolen her composure. Her eyes stayed fixed, calm and unwavering, as though she had simply accepted another test, another hurdle. The others noticed. 2 cots away, a man moaned loudly about his dislocated shoulder. Across the aisle, another complained bitterly that he'd been paired with a dead weight during the buddy carry. Still another argued with a medic, insisting he wasn't as weak as his body had proved. Their words filled the space, echoing the desperation of those who needed excuses to soften their failures. But she said nothing. Not a complaint. Not a justification. Not even a sigh. Her silence was louder than their noise. The medics working on her noticed too. One of them, Miller, was young and still carried the jittery nervousness of inexperience. He muttered under his breath as he adjusted her IV. How's she not crying out? This looks brutal. Torres, the seasoned SEAL medic beside him, didn't answer immediately. He studied her, his sharp eyes narrowing. Torres had served on battlefields. He had treated warriors torn open by shrapnel, Marines who lost limbs, but still gripped his hand with iron will. He had seen courage in its rawest forms, and what he saw in her was not ordinary. He leaned closer, his voice low but steady. Who trained you for this? It was not an idle question. It carried weight, curiosity sharpened by respect. In his mind, there had to be an explanation. No one endured what she had without preparation. Surely, behind her composure, there was a name, some decorated veteran, some former operator who had taken her under their wing. Perhaps she had come from a family with a history of service, or from a program no one else knew about. The question pierced the air, cutting through the noise of the tent. And then everything slowed. The chatter of other trainees faded, their groans quieting as if they too were waiting for the answer. Even the younger medics paused, hands hovering over bandages and instruments, ears straining. A ripple of anticipation spread through the room. Everyone wanted to know. Who had made her this way? Who had carved such resilience into her bones? Her eyes shifted toward Torres. For the first time since she was carried in, she really looked at him. Not with defiance, not with fear, just steady, quiet acknowledgement. Torres held her gaze, waiting. Seconds passed. The silence stretched so long it became its own kind of answer. Miller coughed nervously. "She's not gonna say?" He whispered. Still, she said nothing. Her lips didn't move. Her body didn't shift. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was deliberate. And in that silence, the truth began to dawn. Torres's eyes flickered, realization spreading across his face. No name would come. No mentor, no coach, no hidden elite instructor. She had trained herself. The weight of that truth sank in like a stone dropped into water. The others in the room exchanged looks. Some frowned in disbelief. Others widened their eyes, impressed despite themselves. A few, still sweating and groaning in their cots, fell silent entirely. Torres leaned back slowly, his respect for her growing with every heartbeat. He had asked countless questions in this tent, had demanded explanations from men who claimed to be strong, only to discover arrogance where there should have been grit. But here was something entirely different. A person whose silence carried more force than words. "Wordless," he murmured under his breath, almost to himself. Miller tilted his head. "What?" Torres shook his head, his eyes still on her. "Doesn't matter." But it did matter. It mattered to everyone who had heard the question, and even more to everyone who had heard the silence that followed. Because in that silence was a story. A story of running on worn-out shoes along forgotten dirt roads. A story of lifting buckets and logs in place of weights. A story of bruises, of blisters, of cuts hidden beneath sleeves. A story of long nights alone, training by the dim glow of a lamp, when no one believed and no one watched. She didn't need to tell them any of it. They felt it. They saw it in her scars, in her eyes, in the way she bore pain without complaint. One of the trainees, a man who had complained loudly about his partner during the course, stared at her now with a mix of shame and awe. He had been loud, and yet here she was silent, but stronger than his words could ever make him. Another trainee whispered, "She didn't have anyone. She did this herself." The whisper spread like a current, moving from cot to cot. Soon, the entire section of the tent buzzed, not with groans or excuses, but with murmured respect. And still, she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence had already told them more than 1,000 words ever could. Torres finally rose, patting Miller on the shoulder. "Finish the rap." "She's fine." His voice carried a note of finality, as if he too had been answered. As the medics moved on, the room slowly returned to its rhythm. Groans returned, whispers died down, the chaos of the hospital reclaimed its space. But near her cot, something had shifted. She had become a quiet legend, if only for that moment. Not because she fought harder than anyone else. Not because she was the loudest, or the strongest, or even the most skilled. But because when asked the question that defined everyone else, "Who trained you?" she had given the only answer that mattered. Silence. And in that silence, Every single person there understood. She was not the product of someone else's greatness. She was the result of her own will. No mentor, no advantage. No shortcuts. Just her. Wounded and wordless, she had left them all speechless. The camp returned to routine quickly, but what had happened in that field hospital lingered like smoke after a fire. Word traveled fast. Trainees who hadn't been there heard it secondhand, retold in fragments that grew with every repetition. The story always came back to the same moment. The medic's question, her silence, and the realization it carried. By the time she hobbled back into the training grounds, her legs still braced and her pace careful. Eyes followed her everywhere. Some stared openly, others tried to glance without being noticed. In a place where words usually filled the air trash talk, excuses, promises, swearing her silence had become its own language. She didn't seek attention. She never had. Each morning she rose when ordered, did what she could with the injuries she carried, and stayed out of the noise that always seemed to surround the others. And yet, without trying, she had become a mirror. For some, she reflected their shame. They saw in her what they lacked, the patience to suffer without complaint, the courage to endure without bragging. These men avoided her, their voices dropping when she walked by, their laughter suddenly hollow in their throats. For others, she reflected possibility. A proof that strength didn't need validation, that greatness didn't demand an audience. These ones sought her presence, even if they never spoke directly. They sat near her at meals, mimicked the calm way she breathed during drills, or carried themselves with a little more quiet resolve. The instructors noticed too. They didn't treat her with favoritism. This was not that kind of place, but their eyes lingered on her longer than others. They spoke less often in her direction, not out of neglect, but because there seemed little to say. She had already answered the unspoken questions through endurance alone. One evening, during a rare break, she sat on the edge of the training yard, her injured legs stretched out in front of her. The sun bled red into the horizon, casting long shadows across the dust. Nearby, 2 trainees whispered, thinking she couldn't hear. "She's not normal. No, she's, I don't know, different. Like she's not even fighting the same fight as us." "You think she's scared?" "No, that's the thing. I don't think she feels fear like we do. She didn't turn her head. She didn't correct them. Fear had been her companion once. She knew its weight, its voice, its grip. The only difference was that she had stopped letting it decide her path. That wasn't the absence of fear. That was the mastery of it. Her silence, misinterpreted as mystery, became myth. But myths can be heavy to carry. At night, when the others collapsed into restless sleep, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the barracks. Pain pulsed through her knee. Her body begged for rest, for recovery, but her mind would not quiet. She thought of the medic's question again. "Who trained you?" She could have answered. She could have told them the truth in words as plain as the sunrise, that no one had trained her, that her only companions were discipline and desperation, that every ounce of strength had been forged alone. But she hadn't, because words had always failed her. When she was younger, she had tried explaining herself, tried telling others why she ran when no one asked her to, why she punished her body when comfort was easier. They had laughed, rolled their eyes, or dismissed her as strange. So she stopped explaining. Silence had become her shield, her way of keeping the world from cheapening what was sacred to her. And now, that shield had become something more. It had become the truth itself. The wordless truth was this: she didn't need them to understand. Days stretched into weeks. The program marched forward, brutal as ever. She returned to drills slowly, limping at first, then steadying with each passing day. The medics warned her not to push too soon, but restraint was not in her nature. Pain became background noise, like the hum of a distant engine. During one exercise, she found herself paired with a man who had doubted her since the beginning. He was broad-shouldered, loud, the kind who measured worth in decibels. As they carried a log together, sweat streaking down their faces, he muttered under his breath, "I don't get it. Why don't you ever say anything?" Not once. Not a word. She didn't respond. She shifted her grip on the log, lifted with all the strength she had, and walked forward. By the end of the drill, his breathing was ragged, his pace faltering. She held steady. When they dropped the log, he collapsed to the ground, gasping. She stood over him, sweat dripping, chest heaving, but still silent. He looked up at her, frustration in his eyes. But then, slowly, that frustration gave way to something else: respect. Her silence had given him the answer he didn't know he was asking. Words wouldn't have explained it. Only action could. The wordless truth spread like an unseen current through the trainees. Slowly, without instruction, the camp grew quieter. Complaints dwindled. Excuses faded. Even the loudest voices softened, replaced by determination. It wasn't perfect. There would always be grumbling, always weakness, but the tone had shifted. She hadn't set out to lead anyone. She hadn't asked for attention or admiration. Yet, in silence, she had led them anyway. One night, after lights out, Torres, a medic who had asked the question, passed by the barracks. He paused at the door, listening. Usually, this late, there were whispers, secret conversations, or the muffled sound of frustration vented into pillows. Tonight, there was nothing. Just breathing, steady and tired, like a collective exhale. He shook his head with a faint smile. One person, without saying a single word, had changed the rhythm of the entire camp. That was the wordless truth. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it didn't speak at all. And in her silence, everyone around her discovered something about themselves. That the battles worth fighting aren't announced with words, but proven with actions. The truth wasn't complicated. It wasn't dressed in speeches or philosophies. It lived in her blisters, her bruises, her steady eyes. It lived in her refusal to quit, her refusal to excuse, her refusal to explain. And for those who had the courage to notice, it began to live in them too. She didn't set out to teach. She didn't even know she was teaching. But she was. Every day she walked onto the field, bearing pain without complaint, carrying her silence like a flag. She reminded them of what endurance really meant. The wordless truth was this: greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is unseen. But it is always undeniable. The morning sky was gray, swollen with the threat of rain. The air pressed down heavy, thick with humidity, as though the earth itself was warning of what lay ahead. The trainees lined up in the yard, faces gaunt, uniforms stained with weeks of dirt and sweat. No one spoke. Everyone knew the storm wasn't in the sky. It was in the course awaiting them. This was the day designed to end them. The instructors called it the crucible, though no one dared say the word aloud. A gauntlet of obstacles, marshes, and drills that stretched for miles, meant not only to exhaust bodies, but to hollow out minds. Many who had survived everything up to this point would collapse here. It wasn't a question of if it was, how many. She stood in line with the rest, her legs still stiff from injury, her ribs aching beneath their bandages. Her silence remained, but today it was thinner, like glass that could shatter with one more blow. The weight of expectation pressed against her chest. She had carried herself through storms before, but never with so many eyes upon her. The course began with a run pack's heavy, terrain unforgiving. Rain broke across the sky, drenching the ground into slick mud. Boots slid, bodies slammed into the earth, Curses tore through the air. She ran steady, her limp slight but real. Each step was a negotiation with pain, her knee sending sparks of agony up her thigh. Around her, trainees fell. Some clawed at their knees, others clutched at their sides. Medics dragged away the broken. But she pressed forward, lips sealed, eyes fixed on the horizon. The second phase was worse, a stretch of obstacles designed to punish weakness. Walls that scraped skin raw, ropes that burned palms to blisters, tunnels that forced bodies to crawl face first through sludge. At the wall, she leapt, fingers just brushing the top. Pain flared in her leg, sending her tumbling back. A trainee behind her shoved past with a grunt, hauling himself over. She tried again, and again. Her muscles trembled, her grip faltered, and each failure dug deeper into her spirit. For the first time since arriving, doubt seeped in. Her silence, once her shield, now felt like a weight. Was it enough? Could willpower alone carry her through when her body refused to obey? She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the wall, mud dripping into her eyes. Around her, others groaned and shouted, voices raw with effort. She stayed wordless, not because she wanted to, but because she had no words left. On the fourth attempt, she hooked her fingers into a crack in the wood and dragged herself upward, ignoring the tearing pain in her leg. Her arms screamed, her ribs stabbed, but inch by inch she pulled herself over. When she dropped on the other side, she hit the ground hard and stayed there for a moment, gasping silently, mud and blood mixing on her skin. The course dragged on. Hours blurred into torment. Hunger gnawed, water ran short, and the rain turned cold, sinking into bones. She moved on instinct alone, a creature of endurance rather than thought. But then came the final test, the one that would break nearly everyone. The instructors ordered them into the surf. The ocean, black under the storm clouds, churned with waves that battered the shore like hammers. They were told to link arms and wade in. The water swallowed them immediately, icy knives stabbing into flesh. She gritted her teeth as the tide pulled, her body trembling violently. Around her, men cried out. Some begged to be pulled back. Others broke the chain, swimming frantically toward shore, only to be dragged out by instructors, their time over. She held the chain. She forced her lungs to breathe steady, her eyes to stay calm. But the cold was merciless. It seeped into her bones, rattled her ribs, threatened to shut down her heart. Minutes stretched into eternities. The ocean roared, the rain pounded, the world blurred into chaos. Her vision dimmed at the edges, black creeping inward. Her body was failing. She knew it. Her silence had carried her far, but silence could not fight hypothermia. Her grip on the chain faltered. She thought of everything, of running alone in the dark, of lifting logs by herself, of the medic's question, of the faces that now watched her as if she were more than human. A weight crushed her chest. She wasn't just carrying herself anymore. She was carrying their belief, their whispers, their respect. And suddenly, the silence felt like betrayal. Her mind screamed, though her mouth did not. If I let go now, it ends. Everything ends. The breaking point wasn't her body, it was this choice. To surrender quietly, or to find something beyond herself. The tide crashed harder. Her fingers slipped. She was seconds from vanishing beneath the waves when she heard it, not from her own lips, but from within. A voice, faint but undeniable. Not yet. With a roar that never left her throat, she tightened her grip, forced her legs to lock, and endured. The cold still ravaged her, her body still shook, but she refused to break. One by one, others let go. Medics hauled them out, shivering, defeated. But she remained, a single figure trembling yet unyielding. Finally, After what felt like forever, the instructors blew the whistle. Survivors staggered from the surf, collapsing on the sand. She fell with them, her body convulsing, lips blue, breath shallow. But her eyes still burned. She had reached the breaking point. And she had not broken. That night, as she lay wrapped in blankets, heat packs pressed to her skin, no one spoke to her directly. They didn't need to. Their glances said enough. Awe, respect, even fear. Torres, the medic, passed her cot and stopped. For a moment he studied her, then shook his head with a small, incredulous smile. "You should have broken," he murmured. "Any normal person would have. But you're not normal, are you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Her silence was no longer just her shield. It was her truth, sharpened to its purest point. And now, it was the truth everyone else saw too. The field hospital was quieter now than it had ever been. The storm from the day's crucible had passed, leaving only mud-streaked faces, battered bodies, and exhausted hearts. Trainees huddled under thin blankets, nursing injuries, sharing whispered stories of failure, victory, and survival. And at the center of it all, in her cot, she lay silent. Her leg was swollen, ribs still bruised, and every muscle screamed in protest. Yet despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, she held herself with the same quiet composure that had carried her through weeks of impossible trials. She was the last to succumb to fatigue, the last to surrender, the last to falter when everything demanded it. Torres, the SEAL medic who had once asked the question that stopped everyone, approached her again. He had seen the worst of the course and the best of human endurance. Yet she had redefined both. He knelt beside her cot, adjusting her the fourth, careful not to jostle her wounded leg. For a long moment, he simply studied her, the weight of his experience pressing against his chest. Then, quietly, he asked again the same question he had posed days ago, but now with a softer curiosity. "Who trained you?" Her eyes met his, steady and unwavering. No words came. Her silence had already answered the question in ways that speech never could. Torres shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Of course," he muttered under his breath, as if he had just realized a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. "You didn't need anyone. You built yourself." Word spread quickly among the medics and remaining trainees. Even those who had not seen the ocean challenge or the obstacle course now heard whispers of her feats. They spoke of her silent endurance, her refusal to yield, and how she had carried herself through pain that would have crushed almost anyone else. She hadn't just survived, she had become a symbol. And it wasn't just physical resilience that inspired them. It was the quiet mastery of herself, the ability to endure, act, and persist without expectation or complaint. It was the kind of strength that could not be replicated through training or forced upon another. It had to be forged in solitude, through discipline, and with an unbreakable will. By the next morning, the camp had begun to recognize her as something extraordinary. Not a hero in the conventional sense, not someone adorned with medals or loud accolades, but a figure whose presence spoke louder than any speech ever could. The other trainees approached her cautiously, unsure whether to disturb her silence. Some offered water, others muttered congratulations or questions about her methods. She acknowledged them with a simple nod, never more, never less. Her silence remained intact, but in that silence, they found lessons they could not have learned from words alone. One young trainee, barely able to stand, hesitated before speaking. I don't understand," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "How did you do it? How did you endure everything?" She looked at him, eyes calm, unwavering. And still, she said nothing. But that was enough. Her silence conveyed every answer: discipline, resilience, self-reliance, and the refusal to surrender to circumstance. The lesson was clear. Strength was not about being loud, or about recognition, or about showing off. It was about enduring, quietly, relentlessly, until nothing could stop you. Not the elements, not exhaustion, not even fear. By the end of the week, the course concluded. Trainees were sent home, their bodies exhausted, their minds expanded in ways that would take months to process. Some would carry the scars physically, others mentally, but all would carry the memory of the woman who had walked among them, wounded and wordless, and yet unbroken. Torres watched her one final time as she prepared to leave the hospital tent. The young SEAL medic, who had once doubted his own strength, felt something stir inside him, an understanding that went beyond training, beyond metrics or grades. He saw that real courage did not always need words. Real strength did not always need recognition. Sometimes it simply existed, and those who were willing to observe it carefully could feel its presence, learn from it, and be changed forever. Not many get to see someone like you, he said softly, more to himself than to her. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her life had always been about action, endurance, and results, not words. Outside, the compound was buzzing with the normal post-course activity equipment being cleaned, instructors moving between tents, survivors tending to their wounds. Yet in the midst of this chaos, she moved with quiet purpose. Each step was measured, deliberate, and unhurried. She bore her injuries as a testament, not a complaint. She had been tested to the limits of human endurance, and though her body was battered, her spirit remained untouchable. In the weeks that followed, the story of her silence and her endurance spread beyond the camp. Instructors recounted her feats during debriefings, medics told colleagues, and trainees shared the story in hushed tones. Yet none could fully capture what they had witnessed. How could they? No medal could summarize it, no words could explain it, and no photograph could convey it. Her legacy was carried not in tangible symbols, but in the quiet inspiration she left behind. And perhaps that was the most fitting testament. She had trained alone, endured alone, and emerged without fear. Her silence had been her companion, her shield, and ultimately her language. Every scar, every bruise, every exhausted step had been a sentence in the story she refused to tell in words. And in that refusal, she had said more than anyone could have imagined. Back in her hometown, long after the course had ended, whispers began to reach others' family, neighbors, and strangers alike. They spoke of the girl who had survived a grueling survival course, a young woman who had faced the unthinkable, who had been tested beyond limits, and yet returned not broken, not defeated, but stronger, quieter, and wiser. No one could tell her story fully. Only she could live it, carry it, and continue forward in the same way she had always lived, with discipline, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to endure. Her final lesson to everyone who had witnessed her journey was unspoken. Strength is not loud. Courage is not always visible. Endurance does not need recognition. And sometimes, the most powerful people are the ones who speak the least, but carry the most. Wounded and wordless, she left behind a world that would never forget the quiet proof of what human will could achieve. Her silence had done more than words ever could. And in the hearts of those who watched her, learned from her, and survived alongside her, that silence would echo forever.